Imagine a dark, windy moor in Yorkshire. You see this lonely stone house standing against a bleak gray sky. The wind is just constantly howling around the walls.
Yeah, you can almost feel the cold just thinking about it.
Right. And inside this cold parsonage, there are these motherless siblings. They're sitting completely isolated from the outside world. Sickness and tragedy are just, always knocking at their door.
It's such a vivid image. It feels straight out of a Gothic movie.
It really does. But by the flickering light of the fire, these children are not crying. They are creating magic. They are building these epic, sweeping literary worlds using just a handful of tiny wooden toy soldiers.
I mean, you can almost smell the wood smoke and hear the rain hitting the glass.
Exactly. And that powerful image, that's the foundation of the legendary Brontë family myth. It's a story we all think we know.
We really do.
But today, in this deep dive, we're going to uncover a massive secret hidden behind that myth. Because the famous story of the Brontes actually hides the true literary genius of the sisters.
Right, and this is especially true for the youngest sister, Anne Brontë.
Yes. People constantly treat Anne like the literary Cinderella of her family. They just see her as the quiet, deeply pious sister, sort of lingering in the background.
Yeah, they remember her only as this passive, fragile girl who died tragically young at 29.
That's the popular myth. Society loves a tragic, passive heroine.
They do. But the reality found in her actual writing is completely different.
Completely. So for this deep dive, our mission is to strip away that romantic myth. We're going to put on our English literature professor hats, right? We're going to examine the actual texts and look really closely at the hard data.
Because we want to show you how Anne Brontë was actually a fierce, radical, and highly deliberate writer.
Because honestly, I read through the sources we have for today and I just couldn't believe it. I kept thinking, how did someone this talented get pushed into the background of her own family's story?
It really is wild.
It feels like being the forgotten youngest sibling in a family of incredibly loud overachievers. You scream, but nobody in the house even turns around.
It's a profound historical injustice, honestly. And to really understand Anne's unique literary voice, we first have to look at the crucible of her education.
Right, how her mind was shaped.
Exactly. We have to see how her brilliant mind was forged. Her father was the Reverend Patrick Brontë, and he educated his daughters at home.
He didn't just teach them, basic reading and writing.
No, not at all. He opened his massive, sophisticated library to them. He handed them the heavy, classic works of William Shakespeare. He gave them John Milton's massive epic poem, Paradise Lost.
But he didn't stop at the old classics either. He gave them the modern, rebellious, romantic poets, too. Writers like William Wordsworth and Lord Byron.
Yes, and this is where the foundation of Anne's genius is really poured. The Romantic poets taught these isolated girls a very specific, powerful lesson.
They taught them to value deep, raw feeling over cold, hard logic.
Exactly. You have to consider their emotional environment. These children had known so much death and loss so early in life. Their mother and two older sisters had already died.
The house was basically full of ghosts.
It was. So the Romantic poets taught the surviving siblings to find comfort in the wildness of nature. But more importantly, those poets taught them to trust the power of their own wild imaginations.
And those imaginations eventually created entire complex universes. Charlotte and her brother Branwell created the fantasy world of Angria.
Right.
And Emily and Anne created their own distinct world. They built this sprawling North Pacific kingdom called Gondal.
And we should note, Gondal wasn't just a simple childhood game.
No, it was a massive literary project. It was full of complex, interwoven tales of love, betrayal, and war. Emily and Anne poured all their intense passion into these stories.
They were basically world building on a scale that modern fantasy writers would envy.
They really were. But then the crushing weight of reality hit them. They had to grow up. The wild, passionate imagination of Gondal clashed violently with the brutal reality of Victorian adulthood.
Yeah, their father was growing old, his eyesight was failing.
And they had absolutely no money. So to help support her family, Anne took jobs working as a governess.
We really need to pause and understand how painful and humiliating that transition was for her. A governess was a live-in teacher for wealthy families.
Right.
Anne worked first for the Ingham family and later for the Robinson family. And this was absolutely miserable work.
She was a brilliant, highly sensitive, wildly creative writer.
Yes, but in these grand houses, she was treated poorly. She was treated almost like a common servant. She was forced to manage totally unruly.
Like completely cruel children.
Exactly. Children who had zero respect for her.
You know, it makes me think of a very modern frustration. Imagine you are a bright student today. You just graduated with a master's degree in creative writing, right? You spent years writing brilliant, wild fantasy novels in your dorm room, but you have to pay your rent. So you take a soul-crushing corporate internship. You are forced to fetch coffee for arrogant managers who treat you terribly.
Oh, that's such a good comparison.
Your brilliant mind is completely trapped in a cubicle. That's exactly what happened to Anne Brontë in those wealthy Victorian estates.
That modern comparison hits the nail on the head. Her physical body was trapped in that miserable role, but her mind was constantly observing. She was taking notes.
She was studying them.
She was. Because Anne lived the harsh, painful life of a governess, she weaponized those exact experiences. She used that pain to write her first novel, Agnes Grey.
But she didn't just write a sloppy diary to complain about her terrible bosses.
No, she acted like a true, calculated literary master. She crafted a masterpiece of instruction.
The opening line of Agnes Grey is really fascinating. Anne writes, "All true histories contain instruction." She tells the reader right away what her mission is. She is writing a novel of education.
Notice how deliberate and bold that choice is. Most governess novels at the time were just cheap, sensational romances.
Right.
But Anne approaches her book like a literature professor, designing a curriculum. She wants to educate everyone involved.
She wants to educate her main character, Agnes, through suffering.
Yes, she wants to educate the unruly, spoiled pupils in the story. And most importantly, she wants to educate you, the reader, about the invisible cruelty of Victorian society.
And she uses her characters as incredibly sharp literary devices to do this. Just look at the terrible children Agnes is forced to teach. Anne introduces a boy named Tom Bloomfield.
Oh, he's awful.
He literally tortures small birds for fun. He is a monster in training.
Yeah.
Then there is a girl named Matilda Murray. The text specifically describes her as barbarously ignorant. She curses constantly, she acts completely wild, and she walks around cracking a heavy hunting whip.
Anne builds these grotesque characters to contrast them with true morality. She shows us her deep moral views through character pairings. The best example is how she contrasts the two clergymen in the novel.
Oh, this part is brilliant.
It really is. First, we have Mr. Hatfield. He is the wealthy, powerful rector. He is incredibly arrogant. In one shocking scene, he actually kicks a poor woman's cat.
Which is just awful.
It is. And he completely ignores the sick and dying people in his parish.
Sure.
He represents the ugly hypocrisy of polite society.
And then on the other side, we have the new curate, Mr. Weston. He is the exact opposite of Hatfield. He is quiet and kind.
Yes.
When he reads the church service, he does it with true soul. He doesn't just perform for the wealthy families. He actually prays. And he gently helps a poor, struggling widow named Nancy Brown.
It's a beautiful, subtle contrast. It's no wonder the famous Irish critic George Moore absolutely loved this book. He famously called Agnes Grey simple and beautiful as a muslin dress.
Wow.
Yeah, he said it is a masterpiece where style, characters, and subject are in perfect keeping.
Hold on, though. I have to push back on this idea just a little bit.
Okay, sure.
If she is explicitly calling this a history of instruction and setting up these very clear moral contrasts, doesn't that risk turning the novel into a preachy, boring lecture?
That's a fair question.
I mean, nobody wants to read a long Victorian sermon. How does she actually keep it entertaining and emotional for the reader?
That is exactly where her structural genius comes in. She completely avoids the trap of preaching from a pulpit. She does this through her brilliant use of first-person narration.
Oh, okay.
By having Agnes tell the story directly to the reader, using the word I, Anne creates what literary scholars call a fit reader.
A fit reader. What does that mean in practice?
It means she forces you to become emotionally fit to understand the lesson. You are placed directly inside Agnes's mind. You don't just watch her suffer from a distance.
So feel it.
Exactly. You feel her deep isolation in that massive cold house. You feel her sharp heartbreak when the rich children mock her poverty. You feel her exhausting, bone-deep fatigue at the end of the day.
So the moral lesson isn't a lecture you hear. It's an emotional trauma that you actually live through alongside the character.
Yes, she makes you feel the absolute powerlessness of a working woman.
So she realizes she has this incredible, subtle narrative power in Agnes Grey. She proves she can totally control the reader's feelings and force them to see reality.
She does.
And then she escalates her technique. She decides to tackle even darker, much more scandalous social truths in her next masterpiece, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall.
Calling it an escalation is almost an understatement, honestly. This novel is a massive structural triumph. The plot alone was a total shock to the Victorian system.
Oh, for sure.
The main character, Helen Huntington, does the unthinkable. She leaves her highly abusive, wealthy, alcoholic husband. She secretly takes her young child away from him.
Wow.
She runs away, hides in an old, ruined mansion, and lives under a fake name just to survive.
We really have to pause and look at the legal context of the time here. In Victorian England, that plot was a massive scandal.
A huge scandal.
Women simply did not have the legal right to leave their husbands. They didn't have the legal right to take their own children. By running away, Helen was basically breaking the law and stealing her husband's property just to save her own life.
Exactly. The stakes could not be higher. And Anne frames this highly explosive story with incredible calculated skill. She uses a complex narrative structure called embedded narratives.
Right.
This simply means she puts one completely self-contained story inside another story. The outer shell of the novel is a series of letters written by a male character named Gilbert Markham.
Okay.
But hidden deep inside those male letters, we find the burning core of the book. We find the secret, private diary of Helen Huntington herself.
So why go through all that structural trouble? I mean, why put a diary inside a bunch of letters? Why not just write a normal, straightforward story?
It all comes down to power and evidence.
Yeah.
Helen uses her diary to fix her own truth in a world that wants to erase her. Her abusive husband and his cruel, drunken friends constantly try to manipulate her.
They try to twist reality to make her think she is crazy.
Exactly. So Helen writes everything down. She records the exact, trivial details of her husband's terrible sins. She does this so that her interpretation of the world cannot be denied or overwritten by the powerful men around her.
Wow.
Her diary is her ultimate, undeniable proof of the abuse.
Oh, that is so powerful. You know, if we connect this to how we communicate today, Helen writing in her diary is exactly like a modern person keeping screenshots of text messages.
Oh, yes.
It's like keeping receipts of a toxic relationship. It's a way to stand firm and say, you cannot gaslight me. I have the data. Here is the exact proof of what you did and what you said.
Yes, it is a perfect analogy. And just like those modern digital receipts, a physical diary in the Victorian era was one of the very few pieces of evidence a woman could actually control.
Right.
Anne Brontë knew her book was shocking. She actually defended her brutal novel with an incredibly powerful statement in the preface of the second edition. She said, "I wish to tell the truth, for truth always conveys its own moral."
That is such a bold statement.
It is. She explained that truth often hides far down at the bottom of a well. You have to dive deep into the dark, cold mud and water to finally find the jewel.
So she actively wanted to stir up the dirty, polite mud of Victorian society.
Exactly. She wanted to force society to feel the terrifying pain of women who were legally trapped in abusive marriages.
So we have to ask the big, painful question here. If Anne's work was so structurally brilliant, and if it was so brave and socially radical, why is she so forgotten today?
It's a tough question.
Why do we mostly talk about Charlotte's massive novel, Jane Eyre? Why do we only ever talk about Emily's wild novel, Wuthering Heights?
The answer is incredibly painful. It lies in how history is managed, and specifically how history is written by the survivors.
Ah, right.
When Charlotte published Jane Eyre, it was a massive, loud, immediate success. The highly influential critic George Henry Lewes praised it to the heavens. He famously said reading Jane Eyre was like soul speaking to soul.
And Emily's Wuthering Heights completely shocked people with its wild, dark, almost violent passions.
Right. Readers were absolutely stunned by the character Catherine, crying out in raw agony, "I am Heathcliff."
Right. Those books are loud. Next to these screaming, incredibly passionate novels, Anne's quiet, steady, documentary-style realism was easy to ignore.
It was. But the story gets much worse. We have to look closely at Charlotte's specific role in shaping Anne's legacy. Tragically, Anne died of tuberculosis when she was only 29.
So young.
After her death, Charlotte took total control of her little sister's literary reputation. Charlotte actively tried to protect Anne from the lingering scandal of Wildfell Hall.
How did she do that?
Well, Charlotte wrote biographical notices telling the public that Anne was just a quiet, passive, deeply religious, and somewhat naive girl. She explicitly claimed that Anne didn't really understand the dark, terrible things she was writing about.
Oh, wow. That is a devastating blow to Anne's legacy.
It really was. Charlotte completely minimized her sister's radical genius. She told the world that Anne only wrote those dark scenes out of a strict, painful sense of duty, not out of towering literary brilliance.
But the actual data, the texts themselves, they tell a totally different story.
They absolutely do. If we contrast Anne's focused early success with Charlotte's early, messy struggles, the real truth emerges. Let's look at Charlotte's very first novel, The Professor.
Okay.
It was rejected by publishers multiple times. It featured a very unconvincing flat male narrator named William Crimsworth. It was stuffed full of awkward, incredibly long dialogues in French that totally frustrated English readers.
So Charlotte struggled immensely to find her narrative voice.
She did.
Yeah.
Anne, meanwhile, was highly focused right out of the gate. She was highly adaptable. She went out into the harsh real world to work. She earned her own money.
She observed human cruelty.
Yes. And she quickly wrote two powerful, structurally perfect novels.
So I have to ask a really provocative question here, looking at the psychology of these sisters. Did Charlotte ruin Anne's reputation on purpose because she was secretly jealous of her sister's early focused talent? Or was Charlotte genuinely just trying to protect her fragile little sister's memory from cruel Victorian critics?
That question cuts right to the heart of human nature, doesn't it? The truth is likely a very messy mix of both.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Charlotte loved her little sister deeply. She had to watch Anne suffer and die a terrible, painful death. She likely wanted to protect Anne's memory from the vicious critics who called Wildfell Hall coarse, brutal, and inappropriate for a woman to write.
But by aggressively protecting her, she accidentally erased her sister's immense power.
Exactly. She painted over Anne's fierce intellectual literary radicalism with a soft, pink, passive brush. She turned a brilliant professor into a delicate saint.
So we have to summarize the journey we've taken through the sources today. When you actually look past the famous myth and when you look at the hard data, when you read the text closely with an English professor's eye, a beautiful new truth appears.
It really does.
Anne Brontë was not a weak, passive little sister standing in the shadows. She was a fierce, brilliant writer. She was a literature professor's absolute dream. She used complex narrative structure, secret embedded diaries, and raw, ugly reality to build her stories. She firmly held up a mirror to Victorian society and forced them to look at their own ugly reflection.
She demanded that a deeply patriarchal society feel the crushing pain of the powerless. She demanded that the world respect the sharp, observant minds of working women. Her writing wasn't an accident. It was a highly calculated strike against injustice.
Exactly. And, it makes you think deeply about the dynamics in your own life. Think about your own workplace or your own university classroom. How often do we ignore quiet, steady, deliberate brilliance just because someone else in the room is shouting much louder? How often do we completely dismiss the quietest person at the table, assuming they have the least to say, when they might actually be the most observant person in the room?
It is a profound tragedy of human dynamics. We are naturally drawn to the noise, to the screaming cations, and we completely walk past the quiet, perfectly constructed masterpiece.
Which brings us to our final, lingering thought for this deep dive. Let's go back to that dark, windy Yorkshire moor one last time. Charlotte Brontë accidentally erased her own sister's radical genius simply by trying to write her biography.
Right.
Charlotte controlled the narrative, and the world believed her for over a century. So you have to ask yourself, who is currently writing your story? Are you letting someone else define your brilliance and summarize your potential? And more importantly, what brilliant, quiet rebels are currently sitting completely unread on our bookshelves, just waiting for someone to finally clear away the myth and listen to what they actually have to say?